Ramattra is the worst tank in Overwatch 2. Any situation in which he can find strong value would be found more easily by any other tank on the roster. His abilities are awkwardly slow and don't flow well together. All this while also being easy to punish and having weak damage numbers. Let's break this all down. Let's talk about Ramattra's kit, starting in Omnic form. His Void Accelerator does decent damage and has no damage falloff, which on paper should give him strong neutral value by poking out enemies as they approach. But the reality is that the projectile is so small and the travel speed is just slow enough to make hitting anyone who isn't standing still pretty difficult at anything beyond close range. This is not really a reliable tool to force any defensive reactions from enemies at range, or to finish kills that are escaping from you since the projectiles are easily dodged by any amount of movement by your enemies. Next up is his Barrier, which is a nice tool for blocking important cooldowns or bursts of damage. It has 1000 HP, but it may as well have 1,000,000 since it only lasts 4 seconds and is pretty easy to react to. Your enemies will have an easier time either just waiting out the 4 seconds or walking past it rather than trying to break it. While barriers are a nice tool for tanks, this is by far the weakest barrier in the game. Not only does it have a punishingly short uptime when it's used, but it's also incredibly inflexible when deployed thanks to its ground-restricted placement and 15-second cooldown. Compare this to Sigma's Barrier, which can be deployed in any direction for any amount of time, and be redeployed after only 2 seconds when you take it down. Even if you destroy Sigma's Barrier completely, it only goes on cooldown for 5 seconds before it can be redeployed. Now to be fair, Sigma's Barrier does have the drawback of needing to recharge health between uses, but this does not change how much stronger this barrier is compared to Ramattra's. The strongest use of barriers in Overwatch is to block high priority abilities like Roadhog's Hook, or Ana's Sleep Dart, or D.Va's Self-Destruct. For all of these cases, it doesn't matter if you have 1 HP or 1000 HP on your shield. The ability will be blocked regardless. Even if your Sigma Barrier is fully destroyed, it will take those 5 seconds to begin recharging and then 7 seconds to reach full HP again. That's still faster than the 15 seconds that it takes to recast Ramattra's Barrier. Also, we can't forget that Sigma has another strong defensive resource in his Kinetic Grasp. He has crowd control with Accretion, and he's got a more explosive ultimate when compared to Ramattra. But let's move on. His next ability, which can be used in either of his forms, is the Ravenous Vortex, aka a worse Sojourn Slow. The concept behind this ability is at least interesting, with the ability to pull airborne enemies to the ground and keep them locked down. The reality, however, is that this ability does nothing other than slow enemies. The fact that the pull only affects vertically oriented abilities means that any horizontal movement can easily escape the vortex, or you can just straight up walk out of it before using your mobility cooldowns instead. This is only made more evident by the fact that some of the more relevant characters in the meta right now, like Doomfist and Sojourn, are able to completely ignore this ability since it doesn't realistically deny the mobility from Rocket Punch or Power Slide. On top of this, since it travels as a projectile rather than an immediate placement, it can be difficult to place it exactly where you want it, at exactly the right time, which makes it nearly impossible to react to enemy cooldown usage. It would be nice to be able to outplay enemies flying around above you or a Winston that's trying to jump away, but unless you've predicted their movement perfectly or they're just feeding, they'll probably get out of range before this ability will catch them. Or again, they'll just walk out of it before using their cooldowns. The slow at least is decent here, but again, it's just a worse version of Sojourn's Disruptor Shot since it doesn't do nearly as much damage. Okay, now we're getting to his identity-defining ability, Nemesis Form. When activated, this gives Ramattra 150 extra armor and changes his primary to an AoE punch and his barrier to a block similar to Doomfist's. On paper, this adds a good amount of survivability to his kit and the ability to threaten targets in close range. But when put into practice, the survivability of the block is nice, but just like Doomfist, he becomes incredibly vulnerable to crowd control. Unlike Doomfist, however, Ramattra doesn't have any mobility in his kit to offset that vulnerability. Looking at his pummel in Nemesis form, the damage output is decent, but again without any mobility, it's difficult to keep targets in range unless they're forced to be there by outside factors, such as needing to touch an objective, or other controlling effects from your teammates. The reality is that Ramattra only gets to punch targets that choose to be near him, or in other words, he doesn't have control over his target focus in Nemesis form. This usually means that the only reliable targets you'll be punching are enemy tanks, which is bad news since pretty much every other tank in the game either does more damage, has more crowd control that can outplay you, or will outlast you by having better defensive resources, or some combination of all three of those. Finally, we have his ultimate Annihilation. This does moderate damage over time and lets Ramattra stay in Nemesis form longer. We've already talked about how difficult it is to keep meaningful targets in range during Nemesis form, so this already becomes underwhelming for those reasons. But add on to that fact that this literally only does damage and doesn't add anything to Ramattra's survivability, that makes this ultimate difficult to use mid-fight since the enemy will likely have the tools to burn you down. This leaves you in a position where you either hold block during your ultimate, allowing enemies to get out of range sooner, or you run in on the offensive, leaving you vulnerable in overexposed positions. The only reliable value I've seen for proactive use of this ultimate is when enemies are again forced into specific locations, like an objective in overtime. Once again, Ramattra suffers from his inability to choose his targets. Oh, also, this ultimate gets cut off by barriers and gets cancelled if Ramattra changes back to his Omnic form, only adding to its inflexibility. So what does this all add up to? At the end of the day, Ramattra gets outvalued by every other tank in the game regardless of what kind of playstyle you lean into with his kit. Trying to keep enemies at range and use Nemesis form defensively, Sigma and Orisa do this better while having more damage, crowd controlling effects, and better defensive abilities. Trying to rush in aggressively and brawl the enemy backline, dive tanks like Winston or Doomfist get there faster and more often with mobility and shorter cooldowns, while tanks like Reinhardt get more value over a longer period of time with more survivability and stronger AoE damage. Even tanks with less tanking tendencies, like Roadhog, Junker Queen, or Zarya, all have clearer game plans to play for high-value moments such as hooks, knife pulls, or high energy. And all of them have more impactful ultimates. The biggest problem with Ramattra in my eyes is that he doesn't do anything that will create a clear advantage. He doesn't have mobility in his kit to choose important locations to pressure or split enemy backlines. He doesn't have the defensive resources needed to outplay offensive plays from the enemy. And he doesn't have enough damage to threaten enemy tanks in the front line. The only time he feels like a meaningful addition to the team is when he's pushing an existing advantage, or getting carried in other words. And the reality is, any other tank in the game would push those advantages more easily. Simply put, Ramattra has no clearly attainable game plan to play for, and when he's put at disadvantage, he doesn't have the tools that other tanks have to survive or to outtrade any pressure. So how can we fix him? Thankfully, Blizzard has announced that there are some changes coming. But with how quickly they're turning this around, I'm only expecting a couple of number adjustments that won't fix the core issues with Ramattra's kit. Now, I'm not a game developer, and I don't claim to know a lot about how to balance the game, but I did have some ideas that I think would make Ramattra stronger and more cohesive as a character. Firstly, there are a few things that I think should just happen overnight to make playing Ramattra feel better. These aren't major changes, but these seem like things that should have been part of his kit from day one. Firstly, his shield cooldown should be reduced to 12 seconds, if not lower. This would allow Ramattra to put up a shield, go into Nemesis form the moment it breaks, which takes 4 seconds, and then after the full duration of Nemesis form, which is 8 seconds, he would have his shield available as soon as he gets back into Omnic form, allowing for more flow between his playstyles. And number 2, casting his ultimate should refresh the bonus armor he receives if he's currently in Nemesis form. Often when looking to use your ultimate, you'll go into Nemesis form and then use your ultimate to extend the duration of your transformation. But as it is currently, you would need to change back into Omnic form before using your ultimate to get that armor back, which is an unnecessarily awkward sequence. Now, neither of these changes would make Ramattra strong in my opinion, so let's imagine some changes that could be made to make him feel better and have a clearer game plan. In order to maintain his identity as a form-changing jack of all trades, I think it makes sense to play into the idea of his two forms working together. For example, he could gain a burst of movement speed when changing forms, allowing for more aggressive plays in Nemesis form and a little added safety when swapping back to Omnic form. Maybe doing damage in Omnic or Nemesis form could empower the abilities once you switch forms. For example, making the first punch in Nemesis form do more damage, or making your next barrier in Omnic form have a shorter cooldown or last longer. Alternatively, maybe damage done with your Void Accelerator and Vortex could apply stacks to an enemy that you can detonate with Nemesis punches that add burst damage potential. Other than playing into this idea of form switching more fluidly, I think the only other ways to buff Ramattra would be to either bump up a bunch of his numbers so he does more damage or has more uptime with shorter cooldowns, or make his Vortex something more interesting, like preventing all movement cooldowns, not just vertical ones. Again, I'm not a game designer, so I don't have fully fleshed out ideas about what the consequences of these changes might be, but I think it's clear he needs something to not only be a more viable tank pick, but a more interesting character overall. But those are just my thoughts. I think it's actually such a shame how disappointing Ramattra's kit is, because I think his whole design is extremely cool. He's just not rewarding to play. But let me know what you guys think. Have I missed something that makes him OP? Are you going to be taking him into competitive play on day one? Let me know down in the comments. And this video has been sponsored by Questline Esports. Go check out their channel where we're putting out introductory guides for every hero in Overwatch 2. Link down below. That's going to be it for me today, team. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.